So yeah, I'm Elliot. I work at IFPRI. I'm collaborating on this project with Amin from Cabby, and sadly we're missing our good friend Sam, who couldn't make it today, but props to him for being part of the whole project. Well, give me 1 second. I realised I got ahead of myself there. So today we're going to focus on this simple but increasingly important question of when AI projects in agricultural development say they are participatory, what does that actually mean? Participation has become a moral imperative almost within this space. So it's a requirement for people who are supposed to be doing responsible AI, but actually it's entering into a long and contested history of agriculture and how these kind of projects have been taken part. So our aim today is not to dismiss participation, but to interrogate it and to ask whether a participation is functioning as a design commitment or as a promise to legitimize unequal value capture. So taking a step back in some key concepts, kind of preaching to the choir, I suppose, but we're starting with responsible AI is the design, development and deployment of AI systems in ways that are socially beneficial, context appropriate and aligned with ethical principles. And therefore we think, so participation becomes a key part of that through the involvement of effective stakeholders in the shaping of the design, implementation and evaluation of AI systems. Participation is generally considered beneficial, but it carries these assumptions, right? It is assumed to align AI systems with local needs, it promises legitimacy and trust from the users, and it is expected to reduce harm and unintended consequences. These are powerful claims, but we don't actually have a way of measuring them. And I think this is the contribution we try to add. The other area of context to really bring out here is the agricultural development context, or AgDev as we call it here. So it seeks to reduce food insecurity and rural poverty and climate vulnerability, particularly for global farmers in the global south. But it's been shaped by an enduring legacy of the Green Revolution, and we have these continuing debates between the top-down implementation of innovation by organisations and institutions, and the increased use of farmer-led approaches for participatory extension, etc. So this has kind of emerged as a corrective, reconciling the top-down voice of more powerful while bringing in people to supplement equity concerns. But it remains unclear to what extent this promise of participation is realised in practice. So, quite simply, we did some research and we asked how participatory AI is framed in the current existing literature, what purposes does participation seem to serve, and under what conditions is that participation imagined to operate. We did a critical review of participatory approaches, and as you'll see, Amin will share with us in a minute, a structured analytical framework for assessing the quality and scope of participation. We conducted the scoping review, systematically identifying studies in which participation was articulated as a central principle. And while this resulted in a small number of cases, only 4 papers in total, but it's a very new space. And realistically, we weren't trying to evaluate implementation, but to understand how this is becoming framed in new literature. And based on this analysis, we've developed an analytical framework to assess participation. So across the 4 papers, we had this initial emerging themes. And so the first theme is that participation is diversely conceptualized. So it ranges from individual user feedback or consultation to actual multi-stakeholder collaboration and governance frameworks. So even in this small number of 4 papers, it varies vastly. The second theme is that feedback is often treated as an endpoint rather than a means. So all 4 of the studies emphasize these feedback loops in which farmers had an opportunity to provide the voice in the aspect, but in most cases, this did not extend into co-design, shared decision-making, or ongoing oversight. Rather, farmers are consulted, they test the tools, they provide reactions. Third, ethical orientations varied. So participation is framed either as procedural inclusion, as we mentioned there, forms of social learning and people working together, co-governance and actually having a place to speak, or actually just simply accountability, transparency, or explainability. These are distinct ethical commitments, yet they are grouped together under the same label as participation, and therefore it's just quite a lot of space. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, power remains largely unchanged. Despite participatory intent, authority and control remain largely concentrated in developers, funders, and institutions. This does not mean participation is necessarily meaningless, but it does suggest that participation, as is currently framed, may be more consultative than performative, and that observation motivates the analytical framework we introduce next. So please, I hand over to you, Amin.
Thanks, Elliot. I also just want to reiterate, I think the earlier presentations were an excellent sort of context setting for some of the bits that also became very evident in our concise but I think like very targeted systematic review of these research papers. So I think like Elliot set like the sectoral sort of context setting on where we are looking and how we are evaluating participation. I want to bring a bit more of I think like more policy-oriented theorization of participation in general, and the framework that we've proposed is basically like an intersection of the two. So just at the outset, the three sort of key components of our matrix are participants, process, and purpose. And as each of them suggests, so participants is essentially the exercise of ensuring that you are actually identifying like the relevant stakeholders, not just like in your traditional sense, like governments will always be part of it, governmental agencies will always be part of it, the people who are developing technologies will typically be part of it, but how do you actually envision, not just again in the agriculture context, maybe not just like say that smallholder farmers are your key sort of demographic that you want to target, but within that there are stratas, there are layers, there are like local context which need to be identified, and accordingly I think there needs to be more nuance to how you identify participants. The second bit is the actual process and scope of participation. Again, I'll come back to what I've mentioned there, Arnstein's very iconic piece of civic participation that brings the participatory ladder into picture. But the core concept is that there are like these different tiers of participation, ranging from non-participation, where people are just like bluntly excluded, to like a lot of it, which is, I would argue, like a lot of the current participatory approaches are more tokenistic. And that is the mid tier, where they range from like just like, tokenistically, including to going into tiers of maybe some sort of partnerships, but still not reaching that actual top tier of co-creation and civic empowerment, and that is the third tier. And the third bit is around the purpose of participation. So this is not drawing from like a single piece of literature, but again, like when we were doing like a desk review of literature, it becomes very evident, and anecdotally also it becomes evident, that participation is done for different objectives. A lot of it stems from, like Elliot's already mentioned, that in a lot of cases participation is treated as an end point rather than going through the life cycle of AI development and deployment. So it could be predominantly from like refinement of model. I want to make it more user friendly, and how do I do that? Through engaging the users or the end users better in my process, to actually mixing something like that with like also going into spaces of co-creation and collaboration. And I think like the third bit, which unfortunately I don't think we saw it in any of the papers, but is like what would be your ideal type for this kind of participation is that you actually explicitly speak about how your relevant identified stakeholders are meaningfully contributing through the life cycle of AI design, deployment, and post-deployment. What we've tried to do, again, because we've brought in like a cumulative of existing literature, so in that sense, we are not like the ideas that we are bringing to the table are not strictly speaking novel, but we've tried to build like a scoring mechanism to give, again, like a matrix that can be replicable and can be utilized. As I think like Parul, you were mentioning about like, there needs to be this sort of restructuring of paradigm towards how we bring those injustice, how we treat those injustices and sort of reform participation. So our idea is that this matrix can give you like a slightly quantitative model to assess and evaluate when you are designing such participatory frameworks from the outset, rather than trying to wing it basically. Again, so going back to criterion 1, this is based on Gloria Miller's work, which is actually grounded in improving participation in the age of AI. So she has drawn from more legacy literature on social participation. But she identifies, so I think the first 3 criteria that she mentions, which are SPAR, legitimacy, and urgency, have existed traditionally in extant literature on social participation, including all the way back to Einstein's ladder as well. But it is the element of harm that she actually introduces, which is that in the context of AI, the risks of it, and the very evident sort of lack of accountability when actual risks translate into harm, is a crucial element that needs to be considered when you're talking about participation and who should participate, or the identification of participants. And in that context, she does not only limit itself to directly harmed individuals, but there might be indirect communities who may be harmed. So just in the agricultural context, you may be deploying certain kinds of, we see this growing sort of need. In India, we've had a lot of discussion around the need for building enhanced data centers and increased computational ability. Now, that may not directly be of impact in the short term, but long term, it could have real implications for communities that are currently residing in those regions, who may be deprived of of resources like potable water, for instance, or like fertility in their soil and things like that. So just to bring that element of harm, and for us, the scoring is that if you've basically not considered any of these criteria, then it's a 0. If your participants only meet one of the criteria, then it's a single, and 2 or more is the threshold that actually Gloria Miller sets in her paper to identify relevant participants, and we've given 3+, which is the highest score that we can give if you actually have considered 3 or all 4 criteria in identifying your participants. Then again, the process of participation goes back to anyone who's, I think that font's creeping out, but the idea of participation is drawing from Einstein's social ladder. What we've added there is this partnership score, which we feel is relevant in the AI context more than just in social participation. So again, non-participation is where you have no, or not even any kind of consideration around bringing in relevant stakeholders, and it's a very top-down oriented approach to just deploying technologies and ecosystems in agricultural ecosystems without considering how they impact local communities and what the end result could be. Tokenism is where, in our assessment, most of the current discourse around participation in agriculture sits, ranging from being just namesake participants to a roundtable versus building towards or edging towards that partnership sort of scale, and which is why we've basically created partnership as an additional tier to the other 3 tiers from Einstein's ladder. And the last one is, yes, the highest score again, where you have explicit sort of integration of people throughout your processes into not just design development, but also actual decision making around how AI systems need to be deployed, around how governance needs to be built around them, remains an ideal type right now, because we see vestiges of it, but not really any meaningful implementation of this ideal type yet. The third criterion, again, is purpose of participation. And again, we've done a scoring, we've sort of built in a scoring mechanism for it. So the reason we've put commercial optimization at a 0 is not this scale, I should have probably caveated more earlier, is more oriented towards technologies that are purported to be for social welfare or for the public good. So there is no yes, you should have participation and evaluation of even purely commercial products, but that is not within the ambit of this sort of matrix that we've created. So something that is utilized essentially for a commercial or participation that is done only for commercial optimization is, we've basically scored it at a 0. And mix of commercial and social goals is where, again, we see a lot of the work happening here. So that would be a 1 or a 2 depending on how far you go from commercial into actual implementation of social goals and citizen empowerment. And the third, like 3 is basically, as I said, like the highest score we haven't, at least in our assessment, not witnessed it yet in any of the research papers that we interrogated. So yeah, that remains elusive. And yeah, so through the 3 criteria, we come to a cumulative participatory score, 8 being the highest, 0 being the lowest, and some amount of like interpretation to each of those bands. I am going to close here because we still have a couple of slides, so I'll give it back to Elliot now.
Thanks, Amy. So, you can. So I'm not going to read through all this because I hope the slides are made available.
And when he died in 1960.
And my phone's talking to me. So yeah, this is the actual application to the papers that we looked at. And what you can see here is that first participation often scores modestly on participants. So farmers are named but rarely selected for an explicit power, harm or urgency logic. They are users rather than holders of rights or somebody who needs to be listened to. Second, process remains low to moderate. So feedback is common. Shared decision making is rare. Ongoing governance in participation is rarer still. And then finally, the biggest variation is in purpose. And so some papers frame participation instrumentally, so improving system performance or simply making a system more adoptable. Others frame it ethically, so learning, agency, accountability. And one paper clearly moves forwards by talking about justice and redistributive oversight in Posadas. So the composite scores are less than important than what they reveal. So participation is present across the literatures, but it varies significantly in depth and authority. And then so to close, this was sort of a thought experiment, but and we thought it was going to be a workshop. So we framed our conclusions as claims to be tested. And so this is what we kind of come up with. We need a much clearer definition of terms. So who participates at what stage, for whose benefit, remains inconsistently defined. Without shared definition, participation risks functioning as a rhetorical label rather than a design commitment. I think we've come back to time and again. We need some kind of review-based governance, almost like a scientific review board, I assume, to ensure this kind of transparency rather than just outcomes as a prerequisite for accountability and learning across projects. So a tick box in your paper. So we've offered this metric as a way of moving forward with that, as a benchmark. But I don't think it's a settled standard, and I think anything should really come out of a community of participants like we have here. And it should be iterative and built collectively. And then finally, to end, I think, aligned with the previous presentation, is that we need a justice orientation to design. One of the things that really motivated us here is that agricultural space is one that represents some of the greatest inequities in power, and that the least powerful actors prioritise powerful institutions and increase heightened risk of implementation, e.g. farmers can fulfil the needs of our climate agenda, and extraction, that farmers are actually also a massive source of monetary value for these large organisations. So with that, I thank you, and I look forward to